Hello, and welcome to Gateway to Privacy, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the latest developments and best practices in today's data protection, privacy, and security industry. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out to suggest topics or guests, or with questions about data privacy law.
Hello and welcome to the Gateway to Privacy podcast. Today your hosts are Claude Etienne Armingaud, a partner in the K&L Gates Paris office, Eleonora Curreri, an associate in the K&L Gates Milan office, and Camille Scarparo, an associate in the K&L Gates Paris office. We're all technology lawyers and certified data protection professionals. Hi, Hele. Hi, Camille.
Hi. Hi, Claude.
So, what are we going to talk about today? Last time we were in Austria, and now we're moving to Italy. So, Ele, please do us the honor.
Sure. So, in today's episode, we are discussing a case regarding a US company that developed an app through which selling diabetic products. And in this case, what happened is that an employee sent a marketing communication promoting a diabetic product to 2,000 people, whose emails were copied and literally visible. And because of this, there was an indirect disclosure of health data of these people. And for this reason, this US company decided to notify that breach to the Italian supervisory authority. And from that moment on, actually, investigations from the Garante started, and it led to basically opened a Pandora box, since basically the Garante found out lots of aspects on the basis of which the company was not compliant with GDPR. And this case is pretty interesting because, first of all, the Garante keeps stating that emails are personal data because they do allow the identification of data subjects, and then also offers very interesting views on how to draft a proper data privacy when it's about collecting consent for specific purposes, and also offers an interesting view to US companies that offer services to data subjects that are resident in the EU. So one of the most definitely interesting points is that also the Garante pointed out, as it is essential that employees within a company are very well trained when it's about data subjects and when it's about processing personal data, especially data relating to health.
But it's true that there's a lot of focus on the confidentiality, which is performance undertaking and requirement under GDPR, but you can only achieve that confidentiality and integrity of the data if you train your workforce. It's not explicitly stated in GDPR, but you need to train and you need to ensure that the whole of the organization is familiarized with GDPR requirements. It's basically, you need to create a corporate culture of data protection. Otherwise, you do not achieve that compliance. And it was interesting to note that there was only one issue initially, that data breach. And then, because the Data Protection Authority in Italy had a foot in the door, then it was a free-for-all. And they could basically dig into all the other aspects, not necessarily related to the data breach, but because the data breach was there.
Yeah, exactly. That is what I always point out to clients. And when it's about being compliant to GDPR, one of the main risks they face is that in case of a data breach, once notification is done to the Garante, you never know how the authority is going to react. And of course, investigations may start, and you're defined for 6 months authority within your offices, finding out everything about that. And so basically, this also shows how exactly compliance also starts from within the company. It's all about, training as a Jedi, your employees, and everything starts from there because employees are the first line of defense when it's about data breach and the compliance to GDPR. But also, it's interesting to see how the Garante basically also gives an interpretation of Article 13 of GDPR related to privacy policy, which is incredibly strict. And it mentions that when consent is used as a legal basis, it is important to separate each consent in relation to each purpose. So you want to collect personal data for different purposes based on consent of data subjects. You can do that, but one consent for every purposes is not fine. You need a consent for each and every purpose.
So basically, we need to rely more on Star Wars than Lord of the Rings. There cannot be one consent to rule them all.
No.
And it's important also to note that, as you stated very eloquently, consent is not necessarily required for each and every processing operation, but when it is, it has to be specific to a given purpose at stake. And you cannot bundle this consent together.
Yeah, absolutely. Because consent, and this is what actually the grant has emphasized in its measure, is to be valid. And to be valid has to be compliant with all the requirements set in Article 7 of GDPR. So it has to be specific, freely given, and that is how you do assess that a consent is valid. It's not pre-boxed, because I still see pre-boxed consents. I don't know about you both.
So one of the things I just wanted to go back to the training of employees. One of the interesting arguments that the US company used was that the employee was working remotely, because at the time of the sending of the email, we go back to 2020. It was during the COVID crisis. And they said that the employee was working remotely and was like feeling alone, or not maybe got benefits from any training at all. So we don't know about how much time he had been working for the company, but the fact is that they said that working remotely were kind of affected the way that he got the awareness about the security.
I mean, a lot of people are getting some remote training, but maybe in addition to all the factors, there might have been the isolation of that individual, but also the organization itself was shaken by the pandemic and could not necessarily implement the required training. But it tends to show that you really need to take those training obligations seriously. It has to be embedded in the DNA of the company. And whenever you have members of your personnel that are handling personal data, they are the weak links that can potentially trigger a data breach like this. And I just wanted to go back to the fact that this was considered a data breach, because it may not necessarily sound like the typical data breach that you see in the news. It's not like a ransomware attack. It's not data that was extracted by a bad actor. It was just an employee that messed up and sent a lot of the same email to a lot of persons, and those person's email address were in the to line. It was not in BCC. It was not a mailing list that could not allow the identification of the members of that list. It was just like spread into the open. And it may sound like a very minimal breach. It's like it's a mistake. It could be an honest mistake. And quite frankly, in 2023, sending an email to a lot of recipients without hiding their email address might be bad practice, depending on the intended purpose. But it shows a lack of process internally to ensure that compliance. So a lack of maturity, and this is something that we see a lot in our daily practice. You may have cognizant of the general requirement of GDPR, but you do not necessarily have that DNA embedded.
Sure. Yeah, but the data breach in general, they say that this data breach encompassed related health data. The fact is that employees sent this email, BCC'd people that were registered to receive the newsletter of the US company about diabetics devices. So the fact is that it's health-related data in some way, because you can guess that these people would never have subscribed to the newsletter in case they were not interested in diabetes devices.
It's not because you're interested in the devices that you necessarily are diabetic, but it hints.
Yep.
It's a factor. It's a contributing factor. So the actual wording under GDPR is data related to health. It's not health data. It's a shortcut that we're using. It's related. And something in relation can be very broadly interpreted. And in that instance, I guess that's what was retained, that people were interested in a medical device. It's not necessarily indicative of their condition.
Exactly.
But it's something that is still related to health, generally speaking.
So the company used the argument about saying that people that had subscribed to this newsletter maybe were assistants to general practitioner doctors and not necessarily patients who like the data were connected with.
Absolutely. It's true. But also few data subjects complained about the fact that everyone was invisible. So that's also a reason why the company has notified the so-called data breach. Because actually a few data subjects felt like violated because all those people could actually know that they have this pathology, that they suffer about that. So of course it's a mix, as you said. There were possibly professionals that might be interested in selling the product or use the product to their patients, but also patients. So it's always kind of a very sensitive topic. But also this take me to another consideration that the company is a US one. And we perfectly know that nowadays there's kind of the data war between the EU and the US. Here, actually, the points highlighted by the grant are pretty severe and quite precise and show us not to be flexible at all. So, because, of course, the fact that we were in the full pandemic situation and the lockdown could have been considered as a first major event, but that has not been taken into consideration by the Garante. It was like, no, this is actually a breach. Basically, this is how the fact that there is no compliance at all within your company. There are so many things that need to be fixed because you cannot process personal data without taking into consideration all these aspects. And another important point is that it highlighted the fact that being a US company was incredibly important for it to have a representative within the EU so that other subjects could have reached out to the representative in relation to data privacy questions or his issues. And yes, this of course highlights that the company did not have, this kind of sensitivity towards GDPR stuff.
Yeah, and Article 27, which is the article of GDPR that requires non-European companies that are not established in the EU, but still are targeting EU individuals. So under Article 3, they would be subject to GDPR if they are either offering products or services to EU individuals or monitoring their behavior. They're still directly subject to GDPR. And because they don't have that footprint in the EU, they need to appoint a representative. And we've clearly felt the lack of general understanding of that requirement. And there's a lot of companies that feel like they're not established in the EU, and they may not necessarily be subject to GDPR, so they don't have to bother with that appointment. And that triggered us to basically establish such a service within the firm, which it's fairly basic. Like you're just the interface between the data controller that is not in the EU, the data subject, and the supervisory authority. You're a hub for information to be passed on from one stakeholder to the other, like an orchestra conductor, if you want. And it's fairly easy to implement. It's not costly. And it also allows you to be informed in due time, because we've had the case of several, once again, US companies not established in the EU being fined by the data protection authorities because they were maybe not aware of the investigation, or they didn't bother to interact with the supervisory authority. And what happened in those cases is that the fine without additional elements will be a lump sum amount based on the maximum set by GDPR. So if you have no information available about the global turnover of the company, you're going to be on the 10 or 20 million euro bracket of fines under GDPR. So compared to the cost of appointing an EU representative, it's clearly worth appointing.
It is, but it also sounds to me as, the empire against the rebels, where the rebels are these EU supervisory authorities, trying to emphasize how you have to fall into certain rules when it's about processing EU data subjects' personal data. So yes, and definitely in terms of cost, that's also what I always advise to clients. It's always less expensive to be compliant since the very beginning, rather than paying, fines or going through all the legal expenses for your defense in case of investigations of the authority. So this, I think, is also something that should be pointed out that, of course, if you care about your money and if you do not want to waste your money, it's always better to, just be compliant to act since the very beginning. So the sooner, the better.
Yeah, and going back to Star Wars, like the greatest teacher failure is, but ideally you can implement sufficient safeguards and fail-safe solution that you don't have to fail to learn. You can learn as you go. You can implement that compliance from the very beginning. You can do that assessment and avoid the fines. And so GDPR is going on to its 5th year of enforcement, and the honeymoon period is clearly over. So before, the data protection authorities wanted to work hand in hand with the data controllers, the processor, to get them into compliance. And now they feel like there should be that maturity we talked about a little bit earlier. And if it's not there, they're much less likely to be lenient about it. So at the very least, I guess it's okay if you're not 100% compliant, provided that you've put some good faith effort into getting there. And if you're 80%, 90% of the way there, then show some leniency and help you and flag the issue that are not compliant and help you get there. But if you haven't done your homeworks, then this is not going to go well.
So, of course, as you said, it's not possible to be from the very beginning 100% compliant with GDPR, also because the needs of a company tends to change within time, depending on the development of the business, on the amount of personal data processed. So it's an ongoing process. But it's important to be careful to at least show that you care about that aspect of compliance of your company, that you do realize how sensitive it is as a matter and the implications and the consequences of not being compliant. Because then, of course, there is also another aspect, I think, that is kind of underestimated. That is to say that then all these measures issued by the supervisory authorities also public the name of the company. So I think this is also kind of damage in terms of image of the company itself that should be taken into consideration, especially when the company is a kind of a new one on the marketplace and they're trying to just put a name out for themselves.
Yeah, and it once again, it all goes back to the corporate culture of data protection. If you do not take it seriously, then the supervisory authority will take it seriously for you, and that's not a good solution. And it's not that hard. There's so much emphasis right now on ESG, and the fact that privacy is not part or considered as part of being that ESG is baffling. I suppose it's also because data protection may be making headlines right now because of GDPR, and there was such a shockwave through the world. But for us Europeans, this is something that has been deeply embedded into our culture for the past 40 plus years. And so maybe because of that, because it predated ESG as an actual field of compliance, it kind of led a parallel life. And so organizations have implemented a dedicated data protection office on the one hand and compliance and ESG office on the other, and they may not necessarily be talking or be as coordinated as they should have. But all of this, ESG and privacy, is about companies acting in a more virtuous manner and not being fifth lords, basically, to the individuals. So it's on the paper and in theory, it's not that big of an effort, but operationally speaking, it can lead to a couple of headaches.
It's true. But I think something that also maybe in general companies and people are not aware of is that the importance of personal data also comes from the fact that within the European Union, they are considered as a human rights. So the protection of personal data is a human rights for the European Union, as it is in the needs chart.
Yeah, and for other jurisdiction, it is, maybe we can say it was, because the landscape is a little bit changing. It's taking time, but it's slowly changing. In other jurisdiction, it's more perceived as a commodity, something that you can trade, something that is basically an asset of the company. And I'm not saying it is not, it's just that the data controller is the custodian on behalf of the data subject of the data that subjects are willing to entrust them with. So it's a different approach. And we're seeing a lot of this with foreign clients, and there's a rift in understanding. I do believe, maybe I'm idealistic, that this rift is slowly closing, that they're getting there. Maybe our evangelization is being fruitful. We're not there 100% yet, but hopefully in our lifetime, we'll see that virtuous cycle keep going.
So yeah, one of the things that got the US company, into this fine was also the fact that the purposes and all the information was not transparent enough for the data subjects to receive it clearly with regards to Article 13 GDPR. So the thing that the Garante reproached to the US company was that they bundled the whole consent process with the EULA. So the EULA was on the mobile app. It was showed at the data subjects to the data subjects in the same way. It was like the EULA plus the privacy policy on the same step of the process.
Yeah, and that's bad practice. And once again, like we're talking about companies' maturity and the fact that GDPR is approaching its 5th anniversary. You cannot anymore have one document to rule them all. You have to split, you have to convey the proper information to the data subjects at the right time. And so the EULA is governing the registration to the service. The privacy policy is information about how the data is being handled, and they should be split. And it ties up to another practice that we're seeing a lot of abroad, which is one privacy policy addressing all topics. So it's going to be the users, it's going to be the website visitors, it's going to be the employees, the applicant, the suppliers. You got to split everything as much as you can, because you only, as part of the transparency tenet and the user-friendliness requirement of GDPR, this information has to be tailored to the proper category of data subjects. You need to convey everything that is relevant, but also only what is relevant. You cannot drown the data subject under some information fatigue.
No, you can't, of course. And also because there are not all the data subjects to fully understand what is right, what is wrong with all the documents they've been provided with. So because there is kind of a lack of awareness of individuals, it is important this awareness stands on the companies. So just remember, never allow users and data subjects in general to flag the privacy policy jointly with the EULA. Never do that. Otherwise, the grant will go after you.
The rule of thumb is basically I'm having my mom to read it, and if she has a question or if she looks at me with like a deer in headlights, I know that there's usually something wrong.
It's true. I think is everything for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thanks for listening to us. And thanks, Camille, thanks, Claude, for this amazing conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, LA. Thanks, Camille. Until next time, take care, everyone.
And may the enforcement be with you.
May the enforcement be with you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Gateway to Privacy. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks. That's HUB Talks in your favorite podcast app. Tune in next time for more data privacy insights.